The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the 12th chapter of the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, I have come to set the earth on fire, and how I wish it were already blazing. There is a baptism with which I must be baptized, and how great is my anguish until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to establish peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, a household of 5 will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. A father will be divided against his son, and a son against his father. A mother against her daughter, and a daughter against her mother. A mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In a recent home video, what was captured on the video was a preschool dramatic presentation on a stage. The parents were proudly sitting out front, and the children were all dressed in their finery. Some dressed like trees, some dressed like shrubbery, a few like clouds, and a few in the sun and stars. It was quite an assembly. In the midst of this great pageantry, one of the trees came forward, out of character, came up to the edge of the stage, and you could see his little head poking out of a tree, looked right in the front row at Mom and said, "How am I doing?" I think that's why we come to church every Sunday. We want to find out, how am I doing, Lord? How am I doing? We reflect on the readings. We receive the Eucharist for nourishment. We take a good look at what it is that we are to be. And we wonder, how am I doing? And I can certainly do better. There is a story of a man who arrived at the gates of heaven, waiting to let St. Peter let him in. And Peter stopped him and said, well, you first of all have to accumulate 1,000 points. And so the man says, well, how do I do that? He said, well, start recounting to me a little bit about your life, and I'll keep tally. And he said, well, I was raised in a Catholic family. I was baptized as an infant. I went to a Catholic school. I received First Communion. I went to confirmation classes and was confirmed. And I've been living a pretty good life. And he looked at St. Peter, and Peter said, that's 2 points. And then he said, I'm going to have to step up on this a bit. And he said, well, and then got married in the church, married a wonderful Christian lady. We've raised wonderful children. We've raised them to be solid Catholics, and we've made sure to send them to Catholic schools. We've also been very careful about supporting our church. We've been active. And in business dealings, I'm honest. I make sure that I step up whenever there's injustice. And then we've invited our mother-in-law to live with us. And then he looked up at St. Peter, and Peter said, that's 2 more points. And the man shook his head and said, I'm going to have to rely on the mercy of God. And Peter said, that's 996 points. Welcome to heaven. And that's ultimately what it is about. We always think that it's in the doing, but it's always about relying on the mercy and justice of God. In the letter to Hebrews today, we are reading that the cloud of witnesses are there to surround us, to remind us. The cloud of witnesses are those saints that have gone before us, Those saints, the living saints that are here among us, they remind us that we are to be directed to rid ourselves of sin, those things that cling to us, that keep us from the Lord, that cloud of witnesses that also tells us to persevere in running the race and keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Sadly, though, it's something we've lost in our Catholic tradition. We don't read enough about the saints who have gone before us. We need to have those models imprinted on us. So I encourage you to take a good look at the saints, and we can do it so easily now. You can go on Google, type in a saint's name, and immediately what will pop up is a wonderful biography of a saint. And we need to recognize they've gone through the same struggles we have. They've had the same cloud of witnesses to help them and surround them as well, to do the right thing, to be the best version of what they were created to be. This past Friday, we celebrated one of those saints. His name was St. Stephen of Hungary. There's a little relationship of St. Stephen of Hungary with we people of St. Henry, because he married the sister of St. Henry, so he was a brother-in-law to King St. Henry. Stephen was born in a pagan tribe called the Magyars. Later in life, he became baptized and Christianized all of the Magyars, and to this day, Hungary is a very Catholic nation. As he was reaching the end of his life, he wrote a marvelous letter to his son Emmerich. It appears in the Liturgy of the Hours for Friday. And part of it, I think, is something the parents here would be very well to model themselves after and write this kind of letter to your children. My dearest son, if you desire to honor the royal crown, I advise, I counsel, I urge you above all things to maintain the Catholic and Apostolic faith with such diligence and care that you may be an example to all of those placed under you by God, and that all the clergy may rightly call you a man of Christian profession. Be prudent, trustworthy, and above all, humble and merciful. Be patient and honorable and chaste. This is what makes up the royal crown, so you may attain to the heavenly kingdom. Wonderful words, and they come from one of those cloud of witnesses. And then this Friday, we celebrate another wonderful saint by the name of St. Rose of Lima, a Peruvian mystic. Way back in the 17th century, she became ultimately known for her penance, for her solitude, and for care of the homeless. Her parents wanted something more for her. She was a beautiful young woman. They wanted her to get married. But God had other plans for her, and she wanted to cooperate with God. People began to oppose her and to mock her and ridicule her for her choices. They called her kooky because of her ardent love for God. She eventually professed as a third order Dominican, and then she set up a room in her house, and the rest of her life was spent in care for homeless children, the elderly, and the sick. She endured lengthy periods of sickness, dying only at the age of 31. But during that time, she became notorious for taking care of those poor, the homeless, and the elderly. At her funeral, the entire city of Lima turned out. Prominent men of the city took turns carrying this blessed woman's coffin to the cemetery. These are some of the wonderful stories that we need to read about these cloud of witnesses. We certainly have our Christ as our main model, but it's nice to occasionally pick up a biography of a saint, finding out the same struggles they had are ours, and that they, in turn to the Lord to accomplish what the Lord asks of us today. For Jesus says, I wish to set a fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already blazing. It's not by accident that at the Feast of the Pentecost, tongues of fire appeared over those that were in the upper room. They were set on fire, literally, to accomplish what God was asking of them through Jesus Christ. In a sense, we are to become like kindling and be on fire ourselves, cooperating with Jesus in setting this fire on earth. It means being a prophet. It means going against the grain. Sometimes it means even being ridiculed and mocked and suffering. An old Sunday Peanuts cartoon, I love Peanuts cartoons, once showed Linus and his sister Lucy arguing. It was a knockdown, drag-out argument. Before they came to blows, Charlie Brown came in the center of them and said, the two of you can't keep doing this. Lucy, you are going to hit Linus, and Linus will retaliate and hit you, Lucy. This will go on for the rest of your lives. You've got to stop it now and start loving one another as a brother and sister. With that, Lucy looked at Charlie Brown for a few seconds and then clenched her fist and decked him to the ground. While there were birds twirling over his head, Lucy turns to Linus and said, I had to do that. He was starting to make sense. This is what a prophet ultimately is to do, and that's what Jesus meant also about setting up division. That will happen. And we need to recognize that it's all about, anyway, the loving mercy of God. We turn to the cloud of witnesses, the saints who direct us to be prophets, and we will be identified as Christ's disciples by how we bring mercy and tenderness. And yes, how we bring division as well as we stand in the face of injustice, worldliness, inhumanity to man, hatred, destruction, relativism, immorality, hopelessness, selfishness. And then when our time comes of giving an accounting at the gates of heaven, we won't have any trouble standing before the Lord and humbly say, I throw myself at the mercy of God.